Can Do, an educational neuroscience research centre. He is the co-editor of 3 books for Routledge on Wittgenstein and Scientism, The Brain Can Do Handbook of Teaching and Learning, and Wittgenstein and Contemporary Moral Philosophy. He has published articles on education and philosophy in academic journals and media outlets, including the New York Times. His research focuses on the philosophy of education, character education, and the philosophy of Wittgenstein. His projects currently explore the role of human flourishing in education, academic resilience, and the limits of the science of learning and Wittgenstein's ethics. Tonight, he will be speaking to us on what is the relation between education's epistemic aims and its aims of supporting human flourishing. Thank you. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for that extremely kind introduction, and to the organisers for the extremely kind invitation to speak in this series. It's an honour to be speaking this series, and it's been fantastic to attend all of the seminars this term. I've learned a great deal, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to attend these and to have discussions. I'm looking forward to seeing how the project unfolds over the coming years. You can see my screen, right? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, well, it's widely believed that education's overarching purpose is to support human flourishing. Here's some examples from some influential organizations and people. UNESCO, for example, recently stated that human flourishing is the central purpose of education. Positive psychology holds that flourishing is the goal of education. The Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, who you've seen speak in this series, hold that flourishing is the widely accepted goal of life and the ultimate aim of character education. The Church of England state that our vision for education can be expressed and promoted as one of human flourishing that can inspire what the school is and does. The late educationalist Sir Ken Robinson held that our success is about human flourishing, and there's also other examples there too from the philosopher Harry Brighouse and the former Education Secretary Nicky Morgan. Now, on all of these views, flourishing is held to either be the aim of education or at least among its central aims, and this view is becoming increasingly widespread. But if you like, the orthodox view on education's aims would say that, well, the aim or the primary aim of education is epistemic. That is to say, education aims to increase students' knowledge, advance students' understanding, and develop the cognitive skills and epistemic virtues that support the pursuit of 1 and 2. For example, critical thinking skills and virtues such as autonomy and intellectual curiosity. And when I use the phrase epistemic aims of education in what follows, I take it to encompass these 3 aims here. I describe it as the orthodox view in the sense that I think if you were to ask most people what they think the aim of education is or its primary aims are, they'd express it in terms of these kind of epistemic goals. Now, whether or not we hold that education has a principal or overarching aim or set of aims, it's uncontroversial that its goals include those epistemic aims just outlined and the aim of supporting flourishing. I don't take it to be controversial that education should be aimed to do those things. What the interesting question is, though, is how are those aims related? And that's what I want to explore in this paper today. I'm going to start by outlining 3 broad ways you could respond to the question about this relation. And then I want to look at 4 influential contemporary accounts of flourishing to extract from those accounts or try to extract some ideas about how these aims might be related, the epistemic aims and the aim of supporting flourishing. Those accounts are from Positive Psychology and the work of Martin Seligman, the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, as their accounts articulated by Tyler Van Der Weel, Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, and UNESCO's recent account was put forward last year. I should say that there's an important account here that I haven't included in this paper, and that's Christian Christiansen's account. That's only because I'm currently engaging with that myself, reading his book on that, and I don't feel I have all the details ready yet, but I would say that that's been an important contribution to debates on the aims of education, and the next phase of this project I want to also include Christiansen's account in this analysis. I then want to relate each of those accounts to those 3 ways of responding outlined in 1. I want to put forward an argument for which of those three responses best captures the relation between education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing. And finally, on the basis of this analysis, I want to propose two necessary features, what I argue are two necessary features of an account of flourishing, and a challenge we face in developing an account that includes both of these features. Okay, so to begin, three ways of responding. First response would be that education's overarching aim is to support flourishing, which is supported by the fulfillment of its epistemic aims. So on this view, the fulfillment of epistemic aims plays a supporting role to a greater goal of education, which is to support the development of human flourishing. The second view would be the converse of the first. Education's overarching aims are epistemic, which is in turn supported by supporting human flourishing. And a third view would be that education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing are distinct aims, but they're co-beneficial. That is to say, they mutually benefit one another. Fulfillment of each benefits fulfillment of the other. Now, I take these three responses to be exhaustive of the at least very broad and crude ways in which we could respond to this question. Of course, this is only broadly stating the relationship. But once we could clarify, say, this stage of the relationship between the aims, we could then go in more detail and look at how exactly they're related in a kind of more fine-grained account. Okay, so I'm going to start now then with the account from Seligman in Positive Psychology, or what I think we can extract from his account on the relationship between these aims. Positive psychology is the scientific study of the conditions and processes that lead to human flourishing on multiple levels. Those levels are outlined in the first quote. Its goal is to increase flourishing. To flourish here means to enhance psychological well-being, and well-being, according to positive psychology, is a construct consisting of 5 concrete, directly measurable entities. Those represent the PERMA acronym: positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. To flourish is to increase each of those elements. That is to say, flourishing here is to be understood in terms of increasing psychological well-being in accordance with the PERMA model. Flourishing should also be regarded, according to positive psychology, as the goal of education. Now, Seligman argues and gives good evidence to support the claim that greater well-being enhances learning. And he does this in terms of the PERMA model. So, for example, positive emotion produces broader attention, more creative thinking, and more holistic thinking. And half the chapters in his best-selling 2011 book, Flourish, describes how education can foster flourishing by developing skills for enhancing well-being and strategies for teaching and learning them. And those chapters revolve around the view that schools at every level should teach these skills. Positive education is an educational approach that applies positive psychology's principles. It aims to complement learning by enhancing well-being. And it's clear to express the idea that the aim here is to complement learning, not to compromise learning. As Seligman states in this quote here, teach both the skills of well-being and the skills of achievement. Now, it's uncontroversial to define learning or the skills of achievement such that they involve the epistemic aims of education. So we can reasonably interpret positive education as holding that enhancing well-being, and according to positive psychology, to enhance well-being is to enhance flourishing, can support the fulfillment of education's epistemic aims. Another, if you like, aspect of epistemic features we can extract from positive psychology is the point that achieving certain epistemic goals can contribute towards the fulfillment of 3 of the PERMA elements. So accomplishment, that's the sense of achievement we feel when we in our day-to-day activities, the things we do in our lives. Knowledge, understanding, cognitive skills, and epistemic virtues are accomplishments. It's an accomplishment to possess an epistemic virtue, such as being good at critical thinking, or being a careful reasoner, or being very knowledgeable about some domain. Second, meaning. Students often derive meaning from having their epistemic accomplishments recognized. Third, positive emotion. This can be brought about by the sense of meaning and the feeling of accomplishment that may be experienced by having one's epistemic accomplishments recognized. Now, 2 and 3 are, of course, contingent. That is to say, a student might not derive meaning from having their epistemic accomplishments recognised and might not experience positive emotion. But 1 is a necessary feature of what epistemic skills and virtues are. They are accomplishments by definition. A student needs to recognise this, as I've noted, for them to experience it as such. But positive education aims to teach students the skills in how to do this amongst the many skills it aims to teach. Okay, so the point here is just to argue that we can identify the fulfilment of certain epistemic goals as contributing towards the possible fulfilment to some of the well-being elements in the PERMA model. Okay, so where will we place Seligman's account in the taxonomy of the tripartite set of broad views I outlined? Well, I would argue that it's best captured by the third. Education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing are distinct but co-beneficial, and that's for 3 reasons. First, well-being can enhance learning, and if it can enhance learning, it can support the fulfillment of education's epistemic aims. So we've got a direction going from flourishing to education's epistemic aims now. Remember that psychological well-being on positive psychology is flourishing. Second, achieving epistemic goals can contribute towards several PERMA elements and therefore can enhance well-being. Okay, well now we have the relation going the way around, that achieving various epistemic goals can also support well-being and hence support flourishing. So we've got a 2-way relationship here, which is why I think this view would be best understood in terms of the third in that taxonomy. It's also worth noting, third, that Seligman holds that enhancing well-being should be an aim of education in itself, rather than only playing a supporting role to education's epistemic aims. So we have distinct aims, but they mutually benefit one another. Okay, so that's the account from positive psychology and where I think it should be placed on that taxonomy. Next, I want to look at the account of the Harvard Human Flourishing Program put forward by Tyler van der Wiel, who spoke on the paper I'm going to discuss here earlier in this series. Van der Wiel also defines flourishing in terms of well-being, but much more broadly than positive psychology. He encompasses the literature from psychological well-being in his account, but he also covers empirical studies on other substantial contributors to well-being, through which he aims to offer a broader conception of well-being and flourishing. He defines flourishing as a state of complete human well-being, a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. And on his model, flourishing requires that we are well in the following 5 domains: happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Flourishing is not reducible to these. Rather, van der Wiel holds that they're arguably at least a part of what we mean by flourishing, so they ought to constitute features of any plausible account of flourishing. Now, within that account, if we wanted to identify, say, some epistemic virtues or some role for epistemic aims of education, the only domain in which we could clearly place epistemic features would be the 4th, character and virtue. Why? Well, because those virtues would include epistemic virtues. Van der Wiel includes domains in his account that are not included in some measures of psychological well-being, such as health and also character and virtue. And in his account of character and virtue, he focuses on the 4 cardinal virtues: fortitude, temperance, justice, and wisdom. The cardinal virtue of wisdom, often also called prudence, is not only an epistemic virtues and involves employing other epistemic virtues. So there's one place for epistemic features in van der Wiel's account of flourishing. Van der Wiel outlines 4 pathways to flourishing. These are defined as areas of life that empirical research on well-being and public health suggests have reasonably sizable effects on each domain and therefore strongly enhance well-being. That is those 5 domains I just outlined, and also a 6th domain which is separate to the 5, which we needn't go into here. Those 4 pathways are family, work, education, and religious community. And it's the 3rd of those, of course, I'm most interested in here. For each of those pathways, van der Wiel outlines what evidence from longitudinal studies shows about the ways that the pathway positively affects each of the domains. Now, recall that van der Wiel holds that the primary purpose of education is epistemic. And I say recall because he stated this in the video he circulated for the seminar earlier this term. in that video he presented, he stated that the primary purpose of education is to think, to gain knowledge, to reason, which we could characterize as, if you like, what I called the orthodox view earlier of education's primary aims being epistemic. He does not hold that flourishing is among education's primary aims, and I haven't read him. I haven't read him write anywhere that it should be either. So at most, we could interpret van der Beale's view as holding that flourishing can be included among education's non-primary aims. He does also hold that education is, let's say, sorry, is not in, is an important context in which the promotion of well-being and development of character can and should take place. For example, he holds that schools have a role to play in teaching activities and practices that promote well-being. Okay, so where should we place van der Beale's view in the taxonomy I presented earlier? Well, since he holds that education's primary aims are epistemic, it would seem most appropriate to place his account under the second view I articulated, which was that education's overarching aims are epistemic, which are supported by supporting flourishing. But note that he also holds that education is a pathway to flourishing. And since he holds that education's primary aims are epistemic, education will include those epistemic aims. Now, if education is a pathway to flourishing, it follows that fulfillment of the goals of education can in some sense support flourishing, since education is one of the most significant pathways to flourishing. Moreover, van der Beale holds that education has an important role to play in promoting well-being and character. So 1 to 3, those 3 points listed, the little eyes on that page, show that the third view actually best captures the relation for van der Beale, that education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing are distinct but co-beneficial, because the relation is not only one way. It's not that we have the primary aims of education supported by flourishing, but also it's going the other way around too, with education as a pathway to flourishing and education having a role to play in promoting well-being and character. Okay, so that is the second view I wanted to go through. I now want to turn to the account of flourishing put forward by the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues. The Jubilee Centre defined flourishing in terms of happiness and the fulfilment of potential. To fulfill our potential, we need to develop various virtues. Virtues, they write, are a key to fulfilling an individual's potential. And their definition of flourishing is as follows. Human flourishing is the widely accepted goal of life. To flourish is not only to be happy, but to fulfill one's potential. Human flourishing requires the acquisition and development of intellectual, moral, and civic virtues, excellence specific to diverse domains of practice or human endeavour, and generic virtues of self-management. All are necessary to achieve the highest potential in life. And they put forward a neo-Aristotelian framework in which the cultivation of virtues, some of which are epistemic virtues, is necessary for flourishing. Character education, they hold, teaches the acquisition and strengthening of virtues, and flourishing is defined as the ultimate aim of character education. Character education, they write, permeates all subjects. It's not some separate part of education or some separate subject we teach. Rather, it permeates all subjects and areas of school life and includes all explicit and implicit educational activities that help young people develop positive personal strengths, that is to say, virtues. Now, this is their framework for character and its relationship to flourishing, as put forward in their 2017 framework for character education in schools. And you see on here that the first category on the left, intellectual virtues, these are the ones that possess the most salient epistemic features. Indeed, some of these intellectual virtues are epistemic virtues. Intellectual virtues defined as character traits necessary for discernment, right action, and the pursuit of knowledge, truth, and understanding. And all of the examples given involve epistemic features, and several are epistemic virtues. For example, autonomy is an epistemic virtue. And all help to fulfill epistemic aims, such as gaining knowledge and understanding. The fulfillment of certain epistemic aims, such as developing certain epistemic virtues, is necessary for flourishing on this account of flourishing. They write, all developing human beings need to possess a host of intellectual virtues which guide their quest for knowledge and information. And it's worth also noting that practical wisdom is itself an intellectual virtue, but plays an important role in the other intellectual virtues. Okay, so where will we place the JC's account in the taxonomy? Well, I think this is best placed under the first view, which held that education's overarching aim is to support flourishing, which is supported by the fulfillment of its epistemic aims. And this is for following reasons. First, the Jubilee Centre hold that human flourishing is both the goal of life and of character education. If flourishing is the goal of life, it cannot support the service of some further ends, such as fulfilling education's epistemic aims. This rules out the second view. Second, given the Jubilee Centre's definition of flourishing in terms of character, virtue, and the fulfillment of potential, we can't draw a clear distinction between education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing. That rules out the third view, where the aims were seen as distinct. Third, the development of epistemic virtues is necessary for flourishing on this account. Cultivating these virtues contributes towards education's epistemic aims. So in that sense, the epistemic aims help support human flourishing. And fourth, flourishing requires the fulfillment of potential, which involves developing knowledge and understanding, for example, a sufficient level of self-knowledge and self-understanding, and other epistemic skills and virtues, all of which support human flourishing. Okay, so the final view I'd like to look at to extract views on the relation between these aims is the recent account from UNESCO. This is part of a short research brief published last year, which forms part of UNESCO's International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment, which is a major project launched in September 2019, which provides the science evidence for UNESCO's Futures of Education report. It's interesting to look into. It's all available online, including the paper from which I cite here. Now, that research brief is on meanings of human flourishing in education, and it adumbrates some of the ways in which teaching and learning can contribute to realizing education's purpose. That purpose is human flourishing, and they define flourishing as follows. Human flourishing is both the optimal continuing development of human beings' potentials and living well as a human being, which means being engaged in relationships and activities that are meaningful, i.e. aligned with both their own values and humanistic values in a way that is satisfying to them. Now, what epistemic features does this account have? Well, on living well as a human being, the authors of the research brief write that there are aspects of living that are good for human beings, all human beings, simply because they make a life a human life. And they describe three categories of what constitutes good in that quote where it says are aspects of living that are good for all human beings. Those three categories are relationships, engagement in activities, and agency. And they include learning as an example of an engagement in an activity. Learning obviously includes epistemic aims. Our optimal continuing development towards fulfilling our potential also requires continued learning, which has epistemic aims. The authors also state that cognitive and emotional potentials are needed for various areas of life, including learning, and children are entitled to develop their potentials to the full. Now, we can interpret cognitive potentials here to include epistemic features, and some of these will be necessary for our optimal development, such as certain epistemic virtues. They also write that flourishing is conditional on the contribution of individuals and requires an enabling environment. Among the features including in the enabling environment would be access to education, which would include education's epistemic aims. It would be odd to have education, but not to have those epistemic aims I outlined earlier. Okay, so where we place this in the taxonomy? Well, it falls straightforwardly under the first view. Education's overarching aim is to support flourishing, which is supported by the fulfillment of its epistemic aims. Three reasons for this. First, UNESCO hold that education's central purpose is human flourishing. Second, they hold that fulfillment of education's epistemic aims can support that central purpose. They write, teaching and learning can contribute to realizing education's purpose. That purpose is flourishing. And third, epistemic aims need to be met in order for human beings to reach their potential and reach a state of optimal continuing development, which are necessary for flourishing. Okay, so that's the four accounts I wanted to look at here. I now want to relate each account to the three ways I outlined in part 1. So back to the three ways of responding. The first position seems to be that of the Jubilee Centre and UNESCO, and on a side note that I'm not going into here, the political philosopher Harry Brighouse, who's written a lot on the relationship between education and flourishing, and the Church of England, whose vision for education I mentioned earlier. The second view does not capture any of the views discussed. It does not seem an particularly odd view to hold, but none of the views are captured by this, I don't think. And the third view, that the aims are co-beneficial, seems to be the position of Seligman and van der Wiel. Now, when we look at the accounts in this way, we see some interesting points emerge about the ways in which definitions of flourishing affect the relations, particularly if we distinguish between accounts that focus on well-being as definitive of flourishing and accounts that focus more on character and virtue. Now, the answer we give to the question of the relation between education's aims both depends on and can inform how we define flourishing. Seligman and van der Wiel define flourishing in terms of well-being, with van der Wiel's definition being much broader than Seligman's. It takes into account more aspects of well-being than Seligman's. Now, if we define flourishing in terms of well-being, a distinction emerges between education's epistemic aims and its aims supporting flourishing. And this seems to be because we tend to distinguish between education's epistemic aims and its well-being aims. We see them as doing different things, and as it were in different parts of education, sometimes all together. So a distinction can emerge when we think of flourishing purely in terms of well-being. When we define flourishing in terms of well-being, I've argued that the relation should be understood as mutually beneficial, because enhancing well-being can improve education, which in turn includes supporting the fulfillment of education's epistemic goals, and education can enhance well-being. When we define flourishing in terms of virtue and character, such as in neo-Aristotelian accounts, we don't get the same distinction emerging between education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing. Often they are seen as inseparable, that is to say, the cultivation of epistemic virtues, for example, plays an important role in human flourishing. So if we define flourishing in terms of virtue and character, it seems that education supports flourishing, where education supports flourishing also means that the epistemic aims of education support human flourishing. And it may be that the more the emphasis is placed on character and virtue in an account of flourishing, because of course you could have a hybrid account that involves both. So for example, van der Wiel's account is significantly based on well-being, but does include character and virtue as one of the domains of flourishing it assesses. The more the emphasis is placed on character and virtue, maybe the more the account moves towards being in the first type of view I described, that education's ultimate purpose is flourishing, and any epistemic aims support that ultimate aim. Okay, so I'm now on to, I've just done the analysis then of relating each account to three ways. I now want to look at which response I would argue best captures the relationship between education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing. And there are 3 points that I think are particularly important to take into account when we consider which of the responses to endorse. The first is that well-being enhances learning. Evidence, and when I say enhances here, obviously I don't mean a necessary relation, but also I don't mean something as weak as just well-being can enhance learning. Rather, the claim would be that evidence suggests that well-being tends to enhance learning, play a positive effect in enhancing learning. So evidence from positive psychology shows that increasing psychological well-being tends to enhance learning. And some of the evidence that van der Wiel gathers and synthesizes draws attention to other aspects of well-being that enhance learning, such as physical health. So remember that health is one of the domains he includes in his account of flourishing, one that's, as he notes, is sometimes ignored in certain psychological accounts of well-being. When we include physical health in an account of well-being, there's many ways in which that's going to clearly enhance learning. So for example, increasing evidence shows that activities that improve our physical health, such as exercise, improve cognitive performance. And if you can improve cognitive performance, you can enhance learning. So the point I'm making here is that some of the wider evidence on well-being that van der Wiel gathers shows that well-being can enhance learning more broadly than the psychological areas that positive psychology shows. And the third point to support this is that enhancing learning supports the fulfillment of education's epistemic aims. I've been talking about learning here, but I take learning to include those aims. So that's how this relates to the epistemic aims of education. The second point that's important to take into account is that education enhances well-being. So the converse of the point I've just made, replacing the word learning with education. Of course, there are differences there, but otherwise reversing the relationship. Van der Waals shows this in his account of education as a pathway to flourishing. Okay, he demonstrates there that education is a significant determinant of well-being in that it significantly enhances the various domains of flourishing he outlines. And education, both in Van der Waals' account and under any reasonable account, includes epistemic aims. It'd be very odd to conceive of education without epistemic aims. So fulfillment of education's epistemic aims can enhance well-being, taking into account the evidence that Van der Waals presents. And the third important point to take into account when we're considering the relation between the aims of education is that epistemic virtues, I would argue, or I would agree rather with the Jubilee Centre's account, are necessary for the fulfillment of potential. And I would want to argue that fulfillment of potential is a necessary condition for flourishing, which is probably one of the more or the most contentious claim I might make today. The Jubilee Centre's framework puts forward a convincing model for the ways that epistemic virtues contribute towards the fulfillment of potential and thereby towards flourishing. Fulfilling one's potential involves developing various epistemic abilities, for example, a level of self-knowledge and self-understanding. And the role of the fulfillment of potential and flourishing is supported by various accounts, such as, for example, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs and Brighouse's account of the role of autonomy in flourishing. Okay, so the point I'm making here then is that this is an important point to take into account on how we understand the relation between education's aims. Epistemic virtues are necessary for the fulfillment of potential, I would argue, and that in turn is necessary for human flourishing. We should take the fulfillment of potential to be a condition for what it means to flourish. Now, to give some more support to that claim, I've mentioned there Maslow and Brighouse, and I'll briefly go into some detail about what they show about the relationship between human fulfillment and human flourishing. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. Through the fulfillment of the three levels of need Maslow describes, basic psychological and self-fulfillment needs, he argues that human beings can reach a state of self-actualization, which is often characterized as the fulfillment of one's potential. He used the term to refer to the desire for self-fulfillment, by which he meant the tendency for a person to become actualized in what he is potentially. The idea here is that self-actualization is best understood in terms of fulfillment of potential. Now, this hierarchy is not an account of human flourishing, but it can be used to inform such an account, and it is often referred to in literature on human flourishing, and just gives us one model for how fulfillment of potential is an important part of what it is to, I would say, flourish as a human being. The second is some work from Harry Brighouse. Harry Brighouse has an interesting argument on the way in which autonomy is necessary for flourishing. He argues that it's necessary for flourishing and puts forward a convincing argument for the way in which the development of certain epistemic virtues support flourishing by describing how such virtues are necessary for the development for autonomy. And note that autonomy can also be considered an epistemic virtue in itself. Autonomy, he defines the ability to make and act on well-reasoned judgments about how to live. This requires a knowledge of certain areas, such as sufficient knowledge of the relevant variables to make parental pressure a very small influence. And autonomy itself requires the development of epistemic skills, such as critical thinking skills. Autonomy and flourishing also require a sufficient degree of self-knowledge. The flourishing person, Brighouse writes, is able to adopt alternatives and has the self-knowledge, habits of mind, and strength of character to make the appropriate alternative choices. Now, I include this because this is one way of showing how certain epistemic virtues can be necessary for flourishing. That is to say, if we hold that autonomy is necessary for flourishing, that's one possible example of various conditions we can say are necessary for human flourishing, then you're going to appeal to various epistemic virtues and epistemic skills. And that's going to then allow you to make a stronger claim on the relationship between the epistemic aims of education and human flourishing. That is to say, how achieving certain epistemic aims, such as fostering autonomy, is necessary for supporting human flourishing. That's one way we can include it. We can also include it here in terms of the point I'm making about fulfillment of potential. To fulfill one's potential is to be autonomous, and this you also see emerging in Maslow's account of self-actualization. The person who achieves self-actualization is at the highest level of autonomy, as it were. And so how, if we think of reaching one's full potential as involving various virtues such as autonomy, well, those involve epistemic virtues too, and can allow one to make a case that the epistemic aims of education can support flourishing in another way. Okay, so which type of view should we endorse? So taking into account the 3 points I've just made, that well-being enhances learning, education enhances well-being, and epistemic virtues are necessary for the fulfillment of potential, which is in turn necessary for flourishing. All of that suggests that we should endorse the third view, that education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing are distinct but co-beneficial. That is to say, they can benefit one another as they are fulfilled. The reasons for this are that the first two reasons there show that education's epistemic aims and its aim of supporting flourishing are co-beneficial, as long as we take well-being to be definitive of or an important aspect of flourishing. Evidence from positive psychology supports the first. Van der Weele's account supports the first and the second. And on 3, convincing arguments for the relation between epistemic virtues and the fulfillment of potential are put forward by the Jubilee Centre, and we can also extract arguments from Maslow and Brighouse. An important point, though, to bear in mind is that it may be that the more the emphasis is placed on character and virtue in account of flourishing, the more we move over to the first type of view. Now, of course, I don't want to say here that if we're endorsing the third type of view, we should reject the views that come under the first type of view, or that if we're endorsing the third type of view, we should endorse one of the views I put under that, Seligman or Van der Weele. It doesn't, that those don't necessarily follow. It's more I'm making the claim that on the basis of the analysis done so far and the points I've made, the third type of view on the relation, the crudely stated broad view on the relation, should be the one is the one that best captures the relation between the aims of education. Okay, so I now want to just go through the final part of the talk, where on the basis of what I've said, I want to propose 2 necessary features of an account of flourishing and a challenge we face in developing an account of flourishing that includes both of these. I want to argue, or rather I'm not going to put forward a detailed convincing argument here, rather I want to suggest or even state as a point that should be argued for in further depth, and I plan to do so at a later stage. I want to suggest that well-being and the fulfillment of potential should both be recognised as necessary features of flourishing. The views placed under the third type of view, Seligman's and Van der Weele's, they include well-being, but they don't seem to include the fulfillment of potential. Including the fulfillment of potential would involve including various aspects of character and virtue. Now, Van der Weele does include some aspects of character and virtue in his account, but perhaps not enough to encompass fulfillment of potential. So his account aims to cover the 4 cardinal virtues, but the questions in the measure, they tend to focus, it seems, on moral character and virtue. That is to say that one of the questions, there's 2 questions, one of which focuses on delayed gratification. So how often can you give up kind of immediate satisfaction of something that may bring you happiness for delaying it for some later, potentially greater satisfaction of happiness, and how often do you seek to do good in what you're doing in life. And I think you might need a broader character and virtue in order to encompass fulfillment of potential than his account currently offers. The Jubilee Centre's account includes sufficient aspects of character and virtue to accommodate the fulfillment of potential. It has a very rich and rigorous account of the various virtues, how they relate and how they help a human being to reach their potential. But the Jubilee Centre's account does not define flourishing in terms of well-being, although it does include some elements of well-being, such as happiness. A challenge I think we face is providing an account of flourishing that holds that both well-being and the fulfillment of potential are necessary features of flourishing, and has the resources for showing how one can enhance their well-being and fulfill their potential in the best way possible. If that account focuses on well-being, it may remain under the third type of view in terms of how it understands the relation between education's aims. If it emphasizes character and virtue more, it may move towards the first type of view. This may not be a problem where it's placed, but it's just follows from the analysis I've done that may be the case. Okay, so what is the relationship between the aims then? I've outlined 3 ways of responding. I've then tried to extract views on the relation from 4 influential contemporary accounts, from positive psychology, from Tyler Van der Weel, the account that underlies the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues, and UNESCO's recent account. I then tried to relate each of those to the 3 ways that I outlined. I put an argument forward for the response I think best captures the relation, and I proposed 2 necessary features that I think an account of flourishing should include, and a challenge that we face in trying to develop an account that does precisely that. And my broader work in this area is to try to articulate what that account might look like, an account that includes well-being and fulfillment of potential. And also, as I've said, to bring in some other important resources into this account, such as Christiane Christiansen's account of flourishing as the aim of education. Okay, before I wrap up, an invitation to you all. I run the colloquia program for the research centre that I work for, the Tony Hill Centre for Innovation and Research and Learning. And we have 2 talks coming up that may be of interest to you all here. They're on the 18th of March, the 23rd of March, both quite late in the evening, 8:30 till 9:30 p.m, Zoom webinars. These are usually private events, but we can invite guests. So if you'd like to come, please send me your email and I'll send you a Zoom link. If you can't make it, then recordings of those will be put in our podcast. I've included the link there. By the way, those speakers at those events are Professor Matthew Lee from Harvard for the first one, and Professors Martin Seligman and Richard Layard for the second, all speaking on themes about human flourishing. But if you can't catch them, I'll put them on our podcast soon. And also coming up on that podcast soon is a recent excellent talk that Professor David Johnson gave for our series. I'm looking forward to putting that up soon. The next journal issue that we're publishing that I'm co-editing is on human fulfillment and the aims of education. There's a link to it there. That'll be out at the end of June. And if you wish to follow our activities, then our Twitter link is there. The references are in the PowerPoint. If anyone wants them, I can send it around. Just send me an email. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for a really thorough interrogation of all the different theories of human flourishing. And it's a really helpful way in which to kind of bring together all the various threads of this very, rich seminar series we've had this term. Before I pass the microphone over to David Johnson, I'd like to say if anyone has a question, on the top bar there is a hand icon, and if you raise your hand, I will call you, or you can leave a question in the chat function. So David, over to you.
Jonathan, thank you ever so much. This has been a fantastic, a very robust analysis, and I'm so pleased really in many ways that your paper comes at the end of the series and you were able to draw so fantastically well on papers that have gone before, and it really helped us to knit together the different theorizations and aspects and views and approaches, but you've done so in a very considered way. I really am, I have to say, very impressed by the way you've taken each of the views from the different schools of thought, from the Jubilee, from Harvard, and indeed the nature of the questions. How do we arrive at an account of human flourishing given these very different, sometimes overlapping and complementary, but sometimes a little bit disassociative accounts. And I think certainly for us, the purpose of our program has been, and I think will continue to be, sort of ground clearing, trying to look at the concepts, views, approaches, ideas, interrogate them. And I think you've done a fantastic job not only for yourself in your presentation and your work, but certainly that helps us tremendously in our thinking about things. So I really think that's all I would like to say, Jonathan, to congratulate you again, and also thank you, at the end for inviting people to the Eton series. And as you've mentioned, I spoke at these, and I think they're fantastic events, and the participants I really think are fantastic, and it'd be really great for people on this, seminar to poke your heads around the door and have a look at that. But fantastic. With that, I'll pass you back to Fiona then for questions.
Thank you so much. That was extremely.
Well, before I hand over to people who with questions, I just wanted to say that in the chat there's a lot going on, saying, really superb, excellent presentation, weaving together of some of the latest thinking in the field. So with that, I would like to call on Luke Swan. Luke, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. That was really comprehensive and insightful. In defining the core aims and giving your analysis of where you think we should place our emphasis between the first two types and then the two which might be distinct but related, would you propose that there was coherence and order between the levels at which we define the purpose of education in those ways? Because currently at the top level, the Department for Education places greater emphasis on the economy, culture and adult preparation. We then have lots of different schools who will have their own purposes of education, yourself and others as academics. And then we've got individual teachers who have purposes of education as they see it, and then the pupils themselves who are either told what the purpose is, often who aren't, or who can define it for themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke. That's a great question. So the account I've offered is very broad brush and very crude, and I haven't even gone into detail in saying what precisely the epistemic aims of education are. I've broadly stated some of them. I would agree that further stages of any kind of account like this would have to then go into much more detail on the specific types of aims that education has, and it doesn't just have epistemic aims and aims concerning well-being, as various other aims too, some of which are debatable, moral and political aims, for example, and how those all link together. It's a very interesting project to do that, and there have been many excellent accounts offered of how the ways in which the various aims of education interrelate. And some of those would then come into some of the areas you've said. So, for example, of, say, the epistemic aims of education, one would ask, well, what is the wider purpose of fulfilling that particular aim? Now, that would have various purposes. One might be to support human flourishing, in the sense that it supports development of some particular epistemic virtue, such as autonomy. One might be much more specific. This particular epistemic skill relates to this particular area of life this person might want to go into as a career. Another might be because this is a very useful skill for a human being to have, and we now see how we can get into various debates about the utility of the things we do in education versus, say, the reason for just learning for its own sake. That's going to be a complex web of various questions that need to be taken into account. I fully agree with you. You need to have I think you described it as a tiered approach, or if you like, maybe a web approach to how the aims interrelate, which aim is subsidiary to others, and so on and so forth. And yes, I agree, that's where you'd have to go as part of many stages further with doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Johnson, would you like to take over the mic now?
Yeah, thanks a bunch. Thanks, Dr. Beale. This was really great. Really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to ask about, at the end, you kind of throw in this kind of notion of like fulfilling potential. And I was just curious, like along like what axis or axes, like dimensions, like would you measure whether someone has more or less fulfilled their potential? Like what is potential basically? How do you kind of like try to define it?
Yeah, good. That's a really difficult question to answer and a really important question to ask. I mean, the first point to say is that for any of the things that are measured in well-being accounts of flourishing, they always have both a subjective and an objective side to them. So, for example, in the PERMA model, all of those 5 areas, some of them are entirely subjective, whereas some of them have subjective and objective components, such as meaning. And so a person can have a deeply meaningful life and yet not experience it as meaningful. Seligman gives the example of Abraham Lincoln in his book Flourish as an example of someone that had a deeply meaningful life but didn't perceive it as so. So that's the first point to add in terms of then how we assess fulfillment of potential, because there's going to be a kind of a subjective sense in how one perceives their own potential in some domain and how they feel they've moved towards that and gained the sense of accomplishment that they would take to being indicative of achieving their potential. And there's going to be the objective sense of, well, how does this map on with what your potential actually is? How we could say in specific terms, well, what it means to achieve or fulfill one's potential, that's going to be extremely difficult, but there are going to be various things we could say are necessary features for any human being fulfilling their potential. So, for example, I said here that developing certain epistemic virtues is necessary for that. So I think it's necessary to fulfill one's potential that one needs to be autonomous, because autonomy then relates to areas such as self-knowledge and self-understanding. And how can you fulfill your potential if you're not even able to figure out what your potential might be, because you don't have the requisite degree of self-understanding to do that? So I think we can define it in quite broad terms, in terms of the various virtues one might need to have, and certain perhaps external objective requirements, such as having a certain environment that provides you with some of the necessities that, for example, Maslow outlines on the base level of his hierarchy of needs. But I agree that it would be very hard to assess on a much more fine-grained level, has this person definitely fulfilled their potential and definitely flourished? But I'm not sure we need to go that far to say someone's flourished. We could give a more broad brush account than that, that if various conditions are met, then that's indicative of fulfilling one's potential such that one can flourish in accordance with that feature of what flourishing is.
Great, thank you.
So I have a question. What you've done tonight is a really important kind of inquiry into the kind of normative state of the field. But the way we're kind of conceiving of this project and seminar series is in terms of kind of Brofenbremer's kind of model of becoming and the contextual and cultural factors that are in, part of that. And I suppose this is also a kind of trying to push what you've been doing in the direction of where we're going with next year's set of seminars, which is kind of looking at culture and context and its relationship to human flourishing. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts.
So, sorry, is the question then how this project relates to the wider project for your?
Yeah, all the questions about the nature of becoming, your normative analysis, how it relates to the wider, concept of becoming and culture.
Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you very much again for that question. Yes, okay, so, well, one immediate clear way in which it relates to the concept of becoming is that if we take flourishing to involve the 2 features of argument it should, which is fulfillment of potential and well-being, both of those are things that one can and should enhance throughout one's life as much as one can, and that enhancing both of those is what it means, I would argue, to flourish. In terms of culture and context, well, if we're thinking about those areas of life, developing well-being and developing fulfillment of potential, and how those relate to wider questions setting the aims of education, a particularly important question is which contexts are best for, can we best facilitate those things through, and what can we learn from those contexts as to how the aims of education and the aim of supporting flourishing are best achieved. So, for example, one thing I think we've all learned over the last year is how vital communities are towards flourishing, both individual and more widely. And this is one of the central points in the wellbeing literature, is how important positive relationships and various bonds are, and we can develop that as to how various communities can foster those in important ways for human flourishing. Now, that's something I'd be particularly interested in looking into, amongst many other areas.
Super, thank you very much. Now Katie has a question, and then I'll pass on to David. So Katie, can you take the mic, please?
Yes. So thank you. Thank you, Fiona, for inviting me to these series, and thank you for your very interesting topic presented today. My name is Katie Ennis, and I'm at the U.S. Agency for International Development Africa Bureau. And I have a question. You know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs was met. I talked about the physiological, then safety and security, and it goes up in kind of a pyramid in kind of a linear way. But then you've got contexts. You know, I was just reading some literature this morning that 2/3 of children in Africa are living in poverty, or you have 5 out of 10 children in Rwanda experience some kind of sexual, physical, or emotional violence. And so you have situations where it may not be such a linear, sequential jump. And yet, I'm wondering, how do we deal with flourishing when all of the first 2 layers of that triangle are not met, or it's not possible to meet them, when you've got to change culture and global and economic inequalities that have taken 500 or more years to build? How do we deal with that in those situations? And how do we build models that incorporate flourishing from many different contexts, from the reality of where a lot of people are living in the world, and where sometimes, you know, the spiritual aspects or the emphasis on character may be very strong. And you know, I think there was an economist at the World Bank who was saying that they don't have the numbers yet, but it could be 4 out of 10, every 10 children in Africa are going to faith-based non-state schools. So you have a place where there is sort of some emphasis on development of character and of these virtues and a broader vision of flourishing, but where other things are not met, and it may take several decades or centuries to equalize inequities so that everyone could sort of, you know, have that sort of pyramid in that nice linear way that it's presented on the chart. So I'm wondering, how do you apply the theories in that kind of, you know, real world context?
Thank you very much, Kate, for your detailed question. And that's very perceptive of you to identify those various areas to consider. So I should first of all say that I'm not endorsing Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, you know, in its fullest, in the interpretation that may say that the certain basic levels of needs have to be fulfilled before the next ones are met. And there are, I've learned recently, actually, interpretations of Maslow that see that in his later writings, he didn't think they should be interpreted that way, and that it doesn't have to be the case that one foundational level is, you know, obtained before the next can be fulfilled. In his later work, there's interpretations that say he didn't actually think that. But anyway, I'm not saying we should endorse that view anyway, if we were to say that that is Maslow's view. I would agree with you that it's difficult to articulate what the necessary objective factors that determine what it makes it possible to flourish are, because you see various areas that say contribute towards human well-being higher, let's say, in certain contexts than others, where those contexts lack certain things. So, for example, communities are living in far less affluent circumstances than others, but flourishing less, despite having less resources, but maybe having a higher presence of, say, community. So how do we describe what the basic needs are to flourish? Well, I think there would actually be very, very few external necessities you have to have in place for flourishing to be possible. I think that a sufficient degree of human freedom is one. I don't think someone can be, say, completely indoctrinated or living in a society in which they can't express themselves, or a society in which they can't receive work or education. I don't really think someone can flourish in those kinds of situations, no matter how excellent the other areas of their life are. I do think a person could flourish with very little financial or material needs, but I mean, one of the very important points that Van der Wiel makes clear is that for flourishing to be sustained over time, there does need to be some degree of financial and material stability, and for it not to be something that's only momentary or held for a very brief period of time. That's why he has a sixth domain of financial and material stability, in his account, which tries to show a long-term flourishing will be possible. So in answer to your first question, I don't entirely agree with Maslow's account in terms of the foundational needs having to be obtained before the higher ones can be obtained. And I would say there's very few external necessities, but one would be, say, a sufficient degree of freedom and autonomy, but maybe not some specific set of material needs, unless flourishing were you articulate flourishing to be something that's more possible over a longer period of time. Your second question was about various contexts and how those contribute towards flourishing. And again, I'd agree with you on that point. That relates back also to Fiona's question she asked, that what I'd like to see is what we can learn from various cultures and contexts about human flourishing and about the ways in which certain areas of flourishing can be realized better than in others, and how that can inform how we understand what it means to flourish. And in particular, how we can channel that into meeting various aims in education. Does that answer your question, Kate?
I think the question cannot be answered, but we all seek to attempt to answer it. Yes, so thank you for that. That's wonderful. I appreciate that.
David, can I pass the mic over to you?
Thank you, Fiona, Jonathan. Yes, I mean, in many ways, I suppose, Katie, in her asking a question, has almost answered the question that I haven't yet posed, and so it's a hard question, not for you, Jonathan, but really for all of us, and it's almost an odd question that comes from me, but I think it's one that we should really stare quite squarely in the face, really. So prompted by Fiona's question, by Katie's question, certainly your very good answers to this, absolutely right. My question there, as I said, is a hard question, and we have to take account of it. Is education therefore a necessary precondition to human flourishing? So, of course, your paper tonight, links and relates the purposes and aims of education to well-being, to fulfillment, and ultimately to flourishing. But if one takes Katie's question, certainly about poverty, but also that access to education for many people in many parts of the world is very difficult, and that in many parts of the world, even where access to education is possible, that the quality of that education is so poor that these elements of fulfillment and so on become very difficult indeed. So schools are places that kids come to after having walked for 40 minutes, and they're kind of dead tired, and they might get a free school meal of one description or another, learn very little, and go back home. So schooling in that context is, really needs to be looked at. So I suppose the question then, comes back to it: is education a necessary precondition? And taking account of what Katie has said is really, how do we, with or without education, eradicate poverty, eradicate sexual violence, domestic violence, ethnic conflict and war and so on that trap many people. And so that's a question. And just a little side note, in a sense that I wouldn't, necessarily defend Maslow and self-actualization, the upper end of that continuum. I suppose in the same spirit might mean, I think that we can actually skip phases, that even in poverty, if one looks at many African societies, it is possible for people to be the South African Ubuntu, etc., the work in Rwanda, where people, look after themselves and their neighbors, in a sense, a kind of recognizing of being and who we are sometimes comes in despite of adversity. And if this is what Maslow means by self-actualization, by a freedom to be, as I think Jonathan is arguing, then maybe in a sense this big question for all of us, is education really, a necessary precondition, becomes even more more important.
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for raising it, David. Is education necessary for flourishing? Well, okay, so to try and break this down a little bit, first of all, we're going to have to figure out how we're defining education. If we just have a broad definition as, let's say, access to some resources for learning that are taught by people with, a sufficient degree of mastery in those fields, something like that. Is that therefore necessary for learning? Necessary for flourishing? That's an excellent question. Part of me wants to say that access to education in that broad sense is necessary for flourishing. And of course, that can encompass a home education. It doesn't have to be in an institution. But given that I've laid weight so much on fulfillment of potential, it seems that I'm committed to much more than that, that I'm going to have to be committed to something like receiving an education that puts you in at least gives you some reasonable chance of fulfilling your potential is necessary for flourishing. And that would be quite a controversial claim, because worldwide very few people arguably have the fortune to receive that kind of education, at least for certain periods of their life, if not their whole educational life. So I'm going to have to think about that question, David. But I mean, I would say that I think, for example, UNESCO's account draws attention to learning being a necessary condition for flourishing. That and that's that there is, as it were, one is in an environment in which one can learn such that one can develop one's potentials in various areas. How much we want to say that that environment has to be one that gets you right towards the fulfillment of your potential would be the more difficult claim. So education, insofar as it provides access to learning, I want to say that that's maybe a necessary condition of flourishing, but it's extraordinarily difficult to answer the question of where that should stop, what kind of education should be required, and what level, if you like, and how good that education should be. And that's a really important question I have to think about. But thank you.
There's lots of activity in the chat, and I'm going to call on Daniela and Katie, who have kind of been following up and talking around this subject. Daniela, would you like to say a few words, and then Katie perhaps respond and expand?
Thank you. Well, what I was saying is that maybe the Maslow pyramid means that the basic parts are in function to service to the upper ones. Not necessary that you have to have them completely to achieve the other ones, because we can also find people that have good health and all the materials or all the basic parts completed, and they don't achieve the other ones, and they don't flourish. So maybe it's in another way to understand the pyramid and to understand flourishment, right?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for contributing to that. I'll make a note of that and to respond. Thank you.
Katie, would you like a few words?
Sure, just to respond to that. I think, Daniela, I think that's very insightful, because you could achieve those things and there could be something spiritual missing in one's life. On the other hand, you have a situation where, it could be relative. Mr. David was asking, do you need education to have human flourishing? Well, if you're in a village and you're the only literate woman in that village, you may get special opportunities. You may be asked to be on the Women's Council, or when, there's an NGO that comes with a job, you might be the one who's asked to sort of be a data collector, or things like that. So relative to that context, you may be fulfilling your potential, greater than your peers. But I think maybe it really is relative, and maybe the way that I think human flourishing has the reason I've entered these conversations is because I come from the development space, where I see there's a lot of research, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of efforts to solve problems, but sometimes there has been left behind the emphasis on virtue, or the emphasis on character, or things that come out of there's like an allergy to something that comes from the faith-based world. And so a whole sort of aspect of human experience has been left behind. And I think these conversations are really valuable, that you are having. And I think there could be enrichment. I don't know all the background of how this collaborative formed, but I think there could be enrichment in having these conversations with people who are doing data and research, with people who are, researching interventions, with people who are doing the grassroots, to find and identify these assets when people can consider themselves as flourishing, even when they have maybe not got financial maturity, or relationships may not be perfect, and all of these other aspects of life may not be there, but when they feel self-actualized. And I think that this can enrich the discourse, because I think in another world, in the development world, it's all about, human capital, or the goal is to end poverty, or the goal is to achieve gender equality. It's very focused on reaching, specific goals and specific targets, and maybe framing this in sort of the larger discussion of the sustainable development goals, and bringing, human flourishing, maybe making this like a tabletop word. If I say this to one of my peers, I don't think they'll know what it means, but, like in the Spanish sense of the word, like socializing this concept, to broader audiences, I think there could be a lot of interest in that. So I laud you in mounting this series and getting people together to talk about really important things.
Do you have any comments?
You asking me? Sorry.
Yes. Do you have any comments?
Yes, thank you. So, well, a lot of this has been discussion about Maslow, and I won't enter into about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure that the two speakers know far more about Maslow than I do. But I will offer something further on, because we brought back to David's very important question of is education necessary for flourishing, and some important points we just made about the various ways we can address that question. I mean, just to go into some further detail on that line of inquiry, in further response to you, David, because I don't feel I've answered your questions satisfactorily at all. So I mentioned earlier that it would be hard to maybe say that education is necessary for flourishing to some degree of detail, in terms of what we're going to have to, the kind of details we might have to lay out, and some level of knowledge one should be expected to reach or something. That's going to get into quite controversial areas. But I did mention the development of certain skills, such as autonomy, and how, say, freedom is necessary for flourishing, and also being autonomous is necessary for flourishing, such that one can make the right kind of decisions about their own life, how we could build that into the degree of education that should be necessary for flourishing. Someone should have access to an education such that they can develop the skill of autonomy. I mean, one more I might add to that would be that someone has access to education, and this is related to autonomy, such that they are able to resist being, taken in for certain worldviews that are patently false, having the skills to identify what is true and what is false, and to be able to then construct knowledge reliably. I would say that education is necessary to develop that kind of capacity, and I do think that relates to wider issues we face today about, providing an education that really develops students' skills to identify things like misinformation and to be able to, tell true from false in rigorous ways and so on. That might be something we could also express as part of what education should require. So I guess if we wanted to have a methodology to answer your excellent question, it would be, well, let's look at the kinds of skills and virtues that we can plausibly say are necessary for flourishing, and then what education would need to do to get there. And maybe that would help to build an answer to your question.
I'll just come back, Fiona, if you don't mind, and sorry, and Jonathan, fantastic. I mean, it really, is a naughty question, and one that I posed to myself rather than, in a sense, to you. And just to be clear, I would sort of, fight to the absolute end to ensure that, education is on everyone's agenda and accessible and meaningful for all. So the question isn't to dispute, the value of education, but simply to put it, because it is really important. And this question was placed, it's put in so many countries that have undergone, if you like, revolutions and questions about how one transforms educational systems. But in coming to that point, is it in South Africa, I think towards the end of apartheid, the youth carried placards that said, freedom now, education later. And there were placards like that really put into perspective whether education was a precondition for freedom, or whether political negotiation or revolution or whatever it is, together with education were as important. But it's not to dispute the role of education. And I think I didn't get the name of the previous speaker, but my sense actually of this, and I think, Jonathan, I said this when I spoke to your students in Eton. I cut my teeth on development many years ago in the urban slums of Pakistan, and worked in Faisalabad with communities who were trying to make sense of their situation. So, still standing water, no solid waste removal, absolute abject poverty, and material, the physical conditions around them led to high levels of infant mortality, mosquitoes, all the rest of it. But it was these communities collectively, illiterate communities, who, when through, for example, Freirean notions of community appraisal. I spoke of Robert Chambers's work at Sussex, Rapid Rural Appraisal, which later became Participatory Rural Appraisal, where communities, even in rural areas, were able to take sticks and stones and other artifacts that were immediately available to map their surroundings and to understand what needed to be done. And then even, with that, illiterate communities actually rolling up their sleeves, but with an educative and an educational purpose, and understanding that if we, connected up to tertiary infrastructure, close these open sewers, etc., that would have material benefit to our children's health. If we send children to school for half a day in their rather full schedule of scouring the trash heaps so that we could put food on the table for the family at night. So this is the kind of Chunga community. Parents didn't send their kids to school because they needed to work on the trash heaps. But an understanding, an educative understanding that, half an hour a day, when communities agreed on what that half a day, sorry, not half an hour a day, what the half a day or the day, in a week, all of this drove, over several years I was involved in that project, substantial improvements to the slum areas, but substantial educative benefit to these communities on questions of health, of education, of small enterprise development, of infrastructure, and so on. So the power of education, but when done in collective activity, such as this, was a massive transformatory driver, and absolutely the basis for actualization and fulfillment. Now, poverty remains. One doesn't necessarily abolish that easily, but a sense of pride, a sense of communities being able to negotiate with the municipal council to hold them to account for recreational facilities, for access, and so on, are really the lessons of Latin America, the lessons of the slums in Pakistan, the lessons of the slums in Kenya, Kibera, and elsewhere. And that gives me this real sense, so in a way, if I were to answer my question, then I would say it's not necessarily, schools and the curriculum. And I know we've debated that on this series, is it about what you learn every day and where that sits in the curriculum? And of course, I speak here only of particular context. I'm not suggesting that the whole world operates in this way, but driven by Katie's rather insightful question, then it is these educative means through collective endeavor and enterprise that does, in a sense, lead to self-fulfillment, to actualization of a certain kind, and a sense of belonging and a sense of being. That ultimately might lead to human flourishing. Sorry, I didn't mean to kind of give
That's an extremely rich and important point. Let me just say one thing in follow-up to that that's connected. I entirely agree with the importance of collective accomplishment and collective achievement being something that we should be regarding more in education, and that is something that can support flourishing. So, actually, in the longer version of this paper, one thing I go on to discuss is then, if we want to take into account of flourishing further, what might we do? And one thing I think would be, so Van der Weel's account, for example, includes both aspects of well-being and character and virtue. So in a certain sense, it bridges a gap between, say, neo-Aristotelian accounts and well-being accounts. I then ask, well, what might we add to this account to more fully capture what it means to flourish? And one thing that Van der Weel's account doesn't include is the element of accomplishment from positive psychology. But if you include that, that may raise questions then about whether accomplishment, how good is that for well-being, given, say, like individualistic drives towards accomplishment. But one way of attenuating that issue is to include collective accomplishment as an important aspect of what we mean by accomplishment. And I think that's something we do need to foster more in our education system in the UK. More opportunities to assess collective accomplishment and having that more recognized as what it means to accomplish something, and moving less away from an entirely kind of individualistic view of what accomplishment is, at least in most educational models in the UK.
Terrific. So there has been some chat from Amrita and between Amrita and Mina in the conversation. Amrita, I don't know if you're still on the call. If so, maybe you'd like to take the mic for a while. If not, maybe Mina, you could speak to the topic that you've been discussing in the chat before we circle back to Daniela.
Hi, thank you. I just logged in from another computer, so yeah, this is something that I've been wrestling with myself and some of my colleagues that I do work with in terms of flourishing. And with each day, as we work with more and more teachers and students, we're realizing that there's one dimension of our well-being that is missing, and that is the spiritual dimension. And I know it is opening a can of worms, because sometimes religion, spirituality is like a no-no in the field of education. But I personally I really do think that this is where it's an incomplete view of our human existence. And if you're not taking that piece into consideration, can we really talk about well-being? and I know I'm opening a can of worms, right? But if you go back to what WHO talks about, it does talk about human well-being does include spiritual nature as well. And when you look at psychology and other fields, they do talk about the spiritual side of our existence as well. So I just wonder if that is something that at some point soon, people in education will be open to addressing, because that can help us address this whole piece of trauma and suffering, because suffering has a big place in our flourishing, right? That's like, it's that darkness and light. Like, you need darkness to understand light. And that's where I think to get through the darkness, that's where our spiritual understanding and our spiritual nature can really help us get through that. So there's so much to say, but I'm done. Hopefully we can have this conversation at some point later on.
Rita, thank you very much for that. Mina, would you like a few words before I pass the mic back to Jonathan?
Yes, it's interesting because you're absolutely right, Amrita. The term spiritual can open a can of worms, absolutely. And I know that, at least in the UK, because I know we've got an international body who've attended this talk, the concept of spiritual, moral, social, cultural education is actually underpinning across the school curriculum, and the idea. And I spent a fair amount of work when I was working in schools, trying to actually, I suppose, encompass what that word spiritual means, because I know that in some context the word spiritual can flag up, well, can offer red flags in terms of, are we saying it is about religion? Is it about God? Is it about a certain type of religion? Is it a certain? And I suppose perhaps what we need to kind of consider is that spiritual can be that capacity to reflect upon what we endure and gain meaningfulness from our experiences, even if it can't necessarily solve the problems in the past, but it can actually give us that personal drive to want to move forward, to not just kind of better our own lives, but those lives around us. Maybe that's a capacity of spiritual that we perhaps need to consider in terms of what is that bit that chunk that's missing.
I totally agree with you, and there's so much work that needs to be done behind that piece, right? How do we define spirituality or spiritual nature that is culturally, is taken into consideration, is culturally, relevant and sensitive? And I think that's a whole different field that I hope will come up one day. So.
Yeah, so can I respond? Yeah, so these are fascinating thoughts, and thank you so much for sharing them. I do think it's a fascinating area of inquiry, what exactly the spiritual dimension to flourishing might be and how we understand that. As Mina points out, including spirituality or any kind of spiritual dimension to flourishing some will see that as controversial, but that all depends on the way in which it's defined. I guess the important question, or one of the most important questions, if we want to consider how we include spirituality in account of flourishing, is what is it about spirituality that contributes towards human flourishing? Van der Wiel offers an account of some of the ways in which religion promotes well-being. So religion is one of the pathways, and so it would be interesting to look at what features exactly bring about flourishing from religion as a pathway that we could say are those which we could encompass within spirituality. For example, a sense of coming together with a community behind some common purpose that is, say, beyond what we take to be our day-to-day purposes, something like that, perhaps. Christiansen offers a good account of the ways in which awe-inspiring experiences contribute towards human flourishing. Now that could be placed within, if you like, the spiritual dimension, if you like, mystical experiences. And there may also be ways in which certain spiritual practices can be shown to contribute significantly towards well-being. For example, meditative practices. There would be much evidence for this already, that they can significantly enhance well-being. So we can see how we can build in certain factors that might be part of a spiritual dimension that needn't be controversial, because it needn't make reference to anything metaphysical or any particular organized religion or a set of organized religions or subscription to any particular set of religious beliefs. those areas where it's going to be controversial. You couldn't really, it would be controversial to build in a spiritual dimension that said it required a metaphysical worldview or metaphysical beliefs, and subscription to any religious beliefs, which would typically be metaphysical beliefs. But if those could be avoided, you could have a spiritual dimension that wouldn't be so controversial.
The final question for today, I'm going to pass the mic back to Daniela Salgado. And Daniela, over to you.
Thank you. Well, more than a question, I just wanted to say something, two things that I've been thinking through this conversation. That is that education, because we've been talking about education and human flourishment, and that education, it's a process. Sometimes we miss that it's a continuous action and not an activity. Therefore, it does not consist in reaching a point, but in a continuum, because it's not about accumulating virtues, but about becoming a better person. So finally, I think that most of the last part of this conversation, it's been about when we consider a conception of education or a concept, it always refers to a concept of human person. So I think that it's important to consider that, because it depends on the way that you consider the person that you are going to consider the education and the goals and what you want to achieve, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Daniela. So yeah, I take it to there to be two main points there, both of which I agree with. The first is that flourishing comes along a scale. There's not just the state of flourishing and then everything beneath is not flourishing. I do think that an account of flourishing should represent it as some kind of scale, and it should be difficult to achieve. I don't think flourishing should be something that's quite an easy thing to achieve. If we want to think of it, for example, as the goal of life and as the main goal of education, it's going to be difficult, but relative to context and also subjective to some degree. But nonetheless, it should be difficult, but there should be scales of flourishing, not just you're only flourishing to reach this scale and then that's, otherwise you're not. The second point you made was the importance of intending to do good or become a good person to flourishing. Yes, I would agree that that should be part of an account of flourishing, and that's one of the problems that certain accounts of psychological well-being of flourish face. So, for example, positive psychology, in fact, doesn't include an account of virtue, and so it would be possible, let's say, to enhance one's well-being in accordance with the PERMA criteria, but be a really evil person. And there is some debate on this, debate about whether conceivably a serial killer could thrive. Daniel Habron, for example, wrestles with this question, and you can see how on certain accounts of flourishing, it's possible for extremely evil people to flourish. Some don't see that as controversial. I think we should see that as controversial, that we should aim to account for virtue and character in what it means to flourish. And I do think that it's most important to pay attention to the intention to do good. So I think that the question that's asked in Van der Wiel's measure about intending to do good is a particularly important part of that. That's the most important part of what we're seeking to capture when we try to build in morality into an account of flourishing. What are the person's intentions good as a first step, at least?
This has been an
You're muted.
This has been an incredibly rich, vibrant and dynamic conversation, not just this week, although particularly exciting way to finish the term seminars, but really for the whole of the 8 weeks that this seminar series has been continuing. So I want, as well as thanking John for a fantastically thorough and provocative analysis of human flourishing, that really not brings together all the various threads of this seminar series, but also sets the stage for next year's seminar series. I wanted to thank all of you. We've had a terrific audience from all over the world, and we've in recording this, we've also been able to share it with people who are in different time zones. And I really hope that the recordings on Vimeo can kind of support all of your thinking on the topic. I also wanted to thank the Templeton World Charity Foundation, who have funded this 3-year grant with Oxford University, and to encourage you to keep together and kind of in this community of a very mixed community, which brings together educational specialists with development experts and philosophers, and somehow continue the conversation. Please feel free to contact me. I'll type my email address into the chat. But more importantly, I think maybe we'll think amongst us how we can continue the conversation until this time next year when we have the seminar series again. So I actually like to pass the mic over to David, because this is our last seminar, to kind of bring everything together and to tell us a bit more about how we're thinking for next year's set of seminars, which I hope you'll also be able to join. But my thanks to all of you, and particular thanks to John for tonight's fantastic seminar.
Fiona, thank you very much. And students in now Luke's just got hold of the idea that I was going to propose. If this were in Oxford, as we usually have every year, I would say, much to the chuckles of all the students who are on the call and have been behaving exceptionally well, shall we thank our speaker in the usual way? Now, there is no usual way this year, and I was going to suggest what Luke has just done, because I've only just seen on Teams that we have a little applause thing. So perhaps at the end, when I've made a few remarks, we can all turn our applause symbol on, if I can find mine, and that would be a great screenshot perhaps that Luana could capture for us. But my thanks goes to the students around whom this series has been built and will be in future years, and thank them for their participation. They've attended religiously every week, despite there being no examination question this year, because it comes too late. And I think there's also some kind of, I almost said chat line, which has other implications, but there is a thread of activity elsewhere, which is very rich, and I might encourage them at some stage to publish that with reflections on these seminars. I want to thank Fiona, who's been stoic in her commitment to each of these seminars each week, and to Luana, who've provided us with the most fantastic support this year, and hope that can continue. And all of you, and certainly Fiona's point about, please, let's keep this together as a community. There may not be any formal events, but I'm sure we will try and find a way to ensure that there is some kind of way of just talking to each other, and I'm sure Luana would find such a way. So, type in and whatever, email in, and let's keep it alive. And we hope to see you all there for next year, which we will be sort of shifting from person perhaps to community, I think, but we are delighted to keep this conversation going. So thank you all. Thank you, Jonathan, for tonight, which has been exceptional. Thank you to all the speakers for each of the 8 weeks. And thank you to you participants who've been absolutely fantastic. And just to add, we are thinking of trying to pull this work together into either a book volume or what now looks more likely to be a special issue of a journal. There is a call for papers out that may, that have gone to various constituencies, but I'm sure there are people in this audience who, if you want to receive this call for papers, please let us know. I'm sure you'll be invited to send in an abstract, and we'll see what we're able to do. But thank you.
Thank you.
Let's find the old applause hand. Where is it? There we are. Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David, Fiona, Luana. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks all. Yes. Thanks again, John. It's been terrific tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it was really good. So it's, really what we'd hoped it would be. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Keep in touch. I've got any ideas about how we can continue the conversation. Really open to that. Super.
Thank you both. Have a wonderful
evening. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.